The young women chosen to serve in the temples of Athena were often celebrated by society as blessed, holy, and pure, destined to dedicate their lives to the wisdom and protection of the goddess. Families would proudly offer their daughters, believing this path a mark of honor, unaware of the shadows lurking behind the marbled walls and the gilded statues. On the surface, the temple life appeared radiant. The sound of lyres echoing in the courtyards, the scent of incense drifting through colonnades, and the women adorned in fine robes, performing rituals that were said to bring Athena's favor upon the city. Yet, beneath this serene facade, a chilling reality awaited, one that history has largely whispered about, hesitant to speak too loudly of the abuses hidden in the name of devotion. The initiation of these girls was far more than a ceremonial rite. It was the beginning of a process designed to sever them from the ordinary world and immerse them entirely into the temple's control. From the moment of selection, their autonomy began to erode. Families were persuaded, sometimes coerced, into relinquishing their daughters to a system that glorified spiritual service, but demanded absolute obedience. Once inside, every movement, every glance, and every word was scrutinized. Priests and high priestesses held extraordinary power, enforcing rules that blurred devotion with domination, spirituality with manipulation. The temple's reputation as a sanctuary masked the psychological and emotional pressures imposed upon these young women, who were often left isolated from the comfort of familial support. As days turned into months, the routine of devotion became a cage. Tasks that were outwardly sacred, tending altars, maintaining sacred objects, performing ceremonial dances, often concealed subtle forms of coercion. The young women learned that questioning instructions or resisting rituals, even in the smallest ways, could result in punishments cloaked in piety. Prolonged isolation, public reprimand, or spiritual condemnation, making them fear both the goddess and the mortal authorities. Scholars have suggested that such systems were not merely about obedience, but about breaking the individual will, ensuring that the girls became vessels entirely shaped by temple demands. Yet, what has been most chilling to uncover is how the temple leveraged the notion of honor to mask abuse. Society glorified these young women as paragons of virtue, but inside, their daily existence was filled with unrecorded suffering. They were expected to project devotion and serenity, even as their inner lives were subjected to fear, manipulation, and at times, outright exploitation. The stories that survive hint at whispered warnings exchanged in shadows, secret lamentations behind closed doors, and the careful cultivation of silence by those in power. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, loomed over them as both protector and overseer. Her presence, invoked to justify practices that, by modern standards, seem almost criminal. This delicate balance of reverence and repression defined the early years of temple life. The young women were caught in a paradox. They were exalted publicly, yet constrained privately. They were devoted to a goddess symbolizing intellect and purity, yet subjected to human cruelties dressed as divine will. It is here, in the tension between myth and reality, that the true story begins. A story that demands we confront the unsettling question: what did it truly mean to dedicate one's life to Athena? How much suffering was hidden behind the aura of holiness? And how long did these young women endure before the weight of devotion became unbearable? Before moving to the next chapter of their harrowing journey, take a moment to imagine the echo of their voices in those grand halls, and consider leaving a comment with your thoughts, hitting like, "If this history shocks you," and subscribing to follow the uncovering of even darker secrets still lurking in the ancient temples. The selection of young girls for the temples of Athena was far from a simple act of devotion. It was a carefully orchestrated process, shrouded in ceremony, yet driven by societal and political agendas. Families, often under subtle pressure, were encouraged to present daughters who displayed not only physical grace, but also traits deemed suitable for the goddess's service: obedience, intelligence, and an air of untouchable purity. In some city-states, this selection process was competitive, a silent contest between households eager to claim spiritual prestige, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the personal cost that would fall upon the girls themselves. Once a candidate was identified, the temple hierarchy initiated a sequence of examinations and rituals designed to evaluate her suitability. These ceremonies, outwardly magnificent and solemn, were as much a display of power as they were a test of devotion. Every movement was observed, every response noted, and every expression interpreted as a sign of either promise or potential weakness. Scholars have noted that these evaluations often concealed the beginnings of indoctrination. Girls were subtly taught that their worth was contingent upon absolute compliance, and that the temple's authority was inseparable from the goddess's will. In this way, the selection process was less about honoring Athena and more about grooming a generation of women entirely molded by the institution. Society's role in this process was equally significant. Public recognition of a girl's selection conferred prestige upon her family, but it also created invisible chains. The girls themselves were aware that their actions were scrutinized not only by priests and priestesses, but also by the citizens who celebrated them. Any misstep, any hint of resistance could bring shame upon their family, reinforcing obedience through fear as much as devotion. In effect, the temple wielded social expectation as a weapon, intertwining spiritual duty with societal pressure to ensure compliance before the girls even entered the sacred halls permanently. Moreover, the early indoctrination extended to physical and emotional conditioning. Candidates were gradually acclimated to the temple's demanding routines and strict codes, taught to endure discomfort without complaint, and trained to internalize the authority of the clergy as divine command. The rituals were deliberately immersive, blending awe-inspiring spectacle with psychological reinforcement, ensuring that by the time the girls officially began their service, they were already enmeshed in the temple's control. At every step, the line between sacred duty and manipulation blurred, laying the foundation for a life in which personal freedom would be subordinated to the demands of both goddess and institution. Life within the temples of Athena was structured with a rigid precision that masked its subtle cruelty. The young women, once fully inducted, moved through their days under a system that demanded unwavering discipline and devotion. Mornings began with purification rituals, the scent of burning incense and the echo of hymns filling the air. Yet these acts of worship were only the surface of a far more oppressive routine. Each chore, each prayer, each ceremonial gesture was designed not only to honor Athena, but to reinforce the girls' dependence on the temple hierarchy, shaping them into extensions of the institution itself. The daily schedule was relentless. Girls rose before dawn, performing prayers and cleansing rites that often lasted hours, before moving to tasks of upkeep and preparation for the temple's public ceremonies. Meals were simple, and leisure was scarce. The women were expected to dedicate nearly every waking moment to the goddess, leaving little space for personal reflection or comfort. Yet, it was not just the labor that imposed suffering, but the constant psychological oversight. Every expression of doubt, hesitation, or fear could be interpreted as moral failing, every misstep noted in a system designed to instill obedience through both admiration and dread. Beyond physical routines, the temple fostered a strict social hierarchy that dictated relationships and interactions. Older priestesses exercised near-absolute authority over the younger women, their guidance often blending mentorship with intimidation. Peer interactions were similarly regulated, with rivalries encouraged under the guise of spiritual testing, ensuring that the girls remained isolated, their emotional bonds fragile, and their dependence on the temple's authority total. Scholars have suggested that these mechanisms created a controlled environment where the illusion of sanctity veiled coercion, rendering the young women simultaneously devoted and trapped. Rituals themselves were a form of psychological shaping. Even routine ceremonies demanded memorization of sacred texts, perfect execution of gestures, and display of composure under scrutiny, instilling a constant awareness of observation. The girls' identities slowly merged with the roles they performed. Individuality was sacrificed at the altar of devotion. In whispered accounts preserved in historical fragments, we glimpse the quiet despair of those who chafed against these invisible chains, bound by duty yet yearning for freedom. Through this intricate daily structure, the temple achieved a delicate balance. It cultivated the appearance of divine service while embedding the young women in a web of control, obedience, and silent suffering. Each day reinforced the belief that their lives were dedicated to something greater, even as the human cost mounted silently within the shadowed halls. The initiation rites of Athena's temples were presented to the world as sacred ceremonies, majestic and awe-inspiring. Yet for the young women undergoing them, the experience often bordered on psychological torment. These rituals were designed to sever ties to their former lives, compelling the girls to abandon family, friends, and any sense of individual identity. The ceremonies were elaborate. Girls were adorned in ceremonial robes, led through labyrinthine corridors, and subjected to tests that claimed to reveal their spiritual purity. Onlookers were meant to witness divine devotion, but behind closed doors, the rites were mechanisms of control, instilling fear under the guise of reverence. One of the most insidious aspects of these initiations was the manipulation of trust. Priests and high priestesses, figures charged with guidance, wielded their authority as instruments of both awe and intimidation. The girls were taught that compliance equated to favor from Athena herself, while hesitation or defiance could invoke divine wrath. This subtle intertwining of fear and faith left the young women vulnerable to both overt and covert forms of coercion, rendering their will secondary to the temple's demands. Historical fragments suggest that, while some rituals involved public adoration, others took place in shadowed chambers, where isolation and secrecy amplified the psychological impact. The ceremonies also reinforced the temple's hierarchy. Older priestesses oversaw initiations with meticulous precision, their authority rarely questioned. By creating a system in which obedience was rewarded and hesitation punished, the temple ensured that the girls internalized the structure of power. Every gesture, every word, and every moment of silence became a test. Failure could result in humiliation, ostracism, or more subtle forms of manipulation that left lasting scars. The veneer of sanctity provided cover for acts that modern perspectives would recognize as coercive, highlighting a troubling blend of devotion and control. Moreover, these rites functioned as an early lesson in the suppression of individuality. The girls were encouraged, or compelled, to adopt a persona deemed appropriate for service, serene, compliant, and spiritually attuned. Questioning, resisting, or expressing doubt was framed as weakness, creating an environment in which fear became inseparable from piety. Within the intricate choreography of the ceremonies, the girls learned that the temple demanded not only their labor, but their very sense of self. It is in the tension between spectacle and secrecy, between divine reverence and human domination, that the true horror of the initiations emerges. These young women, celebrated publicly as chosen and blessed, endured experiences that were isolating, intimidating, and psychologically draining. And it is here, at the threshold of their full induction into temple life, that we glimpse the first cracks in the illusion of holiness, where devotion and dread converged in a dance orchestrated by those who wielded both divine and mortal authority. Take a moment to reflect on these hidden truths, leave your thoughts in the comments, and engage with the history that so often goes unspoken. Beyond the spectacle of rituals and ceremonies, the shadow of exploitation in Athena's temples was a grim reality that rarely reached the ears of the outside world. While the girls were publicly celebrated as devoted servants of the goddess, within the marble walls, hierarchies of power allowed those in authority to manipulate and exploit the vulnerabilities of the young women. These abuses were subtle and pervasive. Favoritism, forced labor beyond the guise of devotion, and emotional coercion that preyed upon their desire for approval and divine favor. Each act was carefully cloaked in religious terminology, making it difficult for the girls, or anyone outside, to discern morality from piety. The exploitation often took the form of psychological manipulation. Girls were taught that questioning authority equated to blasphemy, while any hesitation or resistance could provoke social or spiritual punishment. Isolation was a common tactic. Separating individuals from their peers or family connections ensured that dependency on the temple's hierarchy intensified. Scholars suggest that this was a deliberate method to erode autonomy and cultivate unquestioning obedience, blending devotion with control so seamlessly that the young women themselves could hardly distinguish faith from subjugation. Physical labor and strict discipline were also tools of exploitation. Tasks deemed necessary for the temple's upkeep were often excessive, exhausting, and meticulously monitored. The young women were expected to maintain the sacred spaces, prepare offerings, and perform complex ceremonies, often while enduring fatigue and hunger. Those who faltered faced not only public reprimand, but spiritual condemnation, reinforcing a cycle in which labor and suffering were normalized as expressions of devotion. In this environment, endurance of hardship became a measure of virtue, masking systemic abuse beneath the guise of religious duty. Even favoritism within the temple could have a sinister edge. Girls who gained the attention of a high priestess or priest were often rewarded with privileges, but these came at a cost: increased scrutiny, coercion, or the expectation of compliance beyond their personal comfort. Those who resisted or failed to navigate the complex social dynamics could find themselves marginalized, their voices silenced, and their suffering hidden behind the temple's sacred image. This culture of subtle coercion and exploitation highlights a stark contrast between the revered public image of Athena's temples and the hidden reality endured by the young women within. Their daily lives were a delicate dance between devotion, survival, and the quiet horrors inflicted under the guise of sanctity. It was a life in which faith became entangled with manipulation, and the line between spiritual guidance and abuse blurred in ways that history only hints at. Within the walls of Athena's temples, secrets were guarded as fiercely as sacred relics. Hidden chambers, forbidden texts, and whispered practices existed beyond the reach of public knowledge, forming a shadow world known only to a select few within the hierarchy. The young women, though surrounded by grandeur and ceremony, often stumbled upon fragments of this hidden dimension, sensing the presence of power and danger intertwined. These secrets were not merely symbolic. They reinforced the temple's control, creating an environment in which knowledge itself became a tool for manipulation. The chambers were often off-limits, their doors barred by priests or high priestesses who claimed that only the truly devoted could witness the deeper mysteries of Athena. In reality, these spaces served multiple purposes: a site of clandestine instruction, a mechanism of surveillance, and at times, a locus for punishments disguised as rituals. The girls were acutely aware that what they were not allowed to see carried significance far beyond their comprehension, fostering a climate of fear and obedience. Curiosity, once natural, became dangerous, and silence a strategy for survival. Forbidden texts, preserved on fragile scrolls, contained knowledge that was esoteric and often contradictory to the public teachings. Some chronicled advanced philosophical ideas or strategies of warfare attributed to Athena, while others hinted at darker practices, manipulations of power, and the exploitation of those dedicated to the temple. Only the EEV, highest-ranking priestesses and priests, were permitted to interpret these writings, creating an exclusive circle of authority. For the young women, the existence of such texts underscored their limited agency, reinforcing the hierarchy and the subtle ways in which knowledge was wielded to dominate. Even the whispers, the small, secretive communications among senior temple members, played a pivotal role in maintaining control. They circulated warnings, instructions, and coded guidance, shaping behavior without formal edict. The girls quickly learned that information could be as potent as ritual. Understanding or misunderstanding a whisper could determine status, favor, or even punishment. Within this labyrinth of secrecy, fear and reverence became intertwined, making the temple a place where the sacred and the sinister coexisted seamlessly. In these hidden dimensions, the young women glimpsed a truth that the public ceremonies never revealed. The temple was as much a site of power and human ambition as it was a shrine to the goddess. Their devotion was constantly measured, their compliance silently observed, and their understanding of reality deliberately constrained. These hidden structures ensured that obedience was maintained, that knowledge remained a privilege of the few, and that the sacred veneer of Athena's temple obscured the profound control exerted over those who served within its walls. The long-term consequences of temple life were profound, often extending far beyond the marble walls of Athena's sacred halls. Young women, initially full of hope and devotion, found their bodies and minds marked by years of strict discipline, emotional manipulation, and subtle exploitation. Isolation from family and peers, combined with constant surveillance and the pressure to embody divine virtue, produced effects that could endure a lifetime. Some scholars suggest that even after leaving the temple, survivors carried psychological scars manifesting as anxiety, depression, or an unshakable sense of guilt, believing that any lapse in obedience had betrayed Athena herself. The physical toll was equally significant. Endurance of arduous rituals, long hours of labor, and deprivation of personal comfort left many with chronic fatigue, injuries, or long-term health problems. The temple's system, while outwardly designed to cultivate purity and devotion, exacted a hidden cost. Older priestesses who had once undergone the same training often continued these practices, perpetuating a cycle in which the young women's suffering became normalized, almost ritualized, as part of the path to spiritual advancement. This transmission of discipline and control from one generation to the next ensured that trauma remained hidden behind a facade of holiness. Social reintegration presented another challenge. Many who left the temple or were dismissed found themselves unprepared for life outside, having been educated in obedience and ritual but deprived of the IVC skills to navigate ordinary society. Some were shunned or pitied. Others were subtly pressured to maintain secrecy about the temple's inner workings. This perpetuated a cycle of silence, where the temple's true influence lingered even beyond its walls. The young women's experiences became a hidden history, preserved only in whispers, fragmented texts, and the occasional account of those rare individuals bold enough to share their story. Yet, despite the suffering, there were moments of resilience and adaptation. Some women, understanding the mechanisms of control, learned to navigate the temple's hierarchy with cunning, using subtle strategies to secure relative safety or privileges. Their ability to survive the oppressive system highlights a complex interplay of endurance, intelligence, and psychological adaptation. Even so, the overarching truth remained clear. Devotion came at a heavy price, and the veneer of sanctity often concealed a world where fear and manipulation were inseparable from service. It is here, in the intersection of devotion and suffering, that the full cost of temple life becomes apparent. The young women were exalted publicly, yet constrained privately, praised for holiness, yet subjected to a system that prioritized obedience over well-being. Their stories, though rarely told, challenge our understanding of sacred service, urging us to recognize the human cost hidden behind divine reverence. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Reflect on these untold hardships and consider the resilience required to endure them. The role of priests and high priestesses within Athena's temples was pivotal, shaping not only the rituals but the very lives of the young women in their care. These figures wielded immense power, their authority framed as divine guidance, yet it often served as a tool for control and manipulation. Priests dictated the schedule, the rituals, and even the social interactions of the girls, while high priestesses oversaw initiation, training, and the subtle enforcement of obedience. Every action taken by the young women was scrutinized, evaluated, and either rewarded or corrected, creating an environment in which fear and reverence were inseparable. The hierarchy within the temple was intricate. Senior priestesses, often once girls themselves, had internalized the methods of control and perpetuated them with meticulous precision. Their authority extended beyond public duties. They monitored behavior, interpreted the sacred texts, and guided the novices through ceremonies with an almost surgical awareness of psychological influence. In doing so, they reinforced a culture in which compliance was equated with virtue, while doubt or resistance was subtly punished under the guise of spiritual education. The young women learned quickly that navigating this hierarchy required intelligence, discretion, and constant vigilance. Priests, on the other hand, wielded influence through ritual authority and public presence. Their interpretations of sacred law shaped not only temple practice, but also social perception. By presenting themselves as intermediaries between Athena and her devotees, they cultivated a climate in which the girls internalized obedience as divine will. This intricate system ensured that power was maintained not through overt cruelty alone, but through carefully orchestrated psychological dominance, masked by the outward trappings of piety. Together, priests and high priestesses created a network of control that reinforced the temple structure. Loyalty, devotion, and fear became tools as potent as incense and ceremony, ensuring that the girls remained under constant supervision and that the temple's influence extended beyond ritual performance into every aspect of daily life. Their authority was absolute, yet veiled in sanctity, making the line between guidance and coercion nearly invisible to the young women themselves. Within this web of power, the girls' lives were carefully shaped, their identities molded to fit the temple's vision, and their understanding of freedom subtly constrained in the name of devotion. The contrast between myth and reality in Athena's temples is striking. Public narratives celebrated the temples as bastions of wisdom, purity, and divine protection, depicting the young women as honored servants of a benevolent goddess. Statues, inscriptions, and poetry painted images of serenity and devotion, reinforcing the idea that life within the temple was a noble calling. Yet, archaeological findings and historical records reveal a far darker truth, one in which hidden suffering, manipulation, and coercion were woven into the very fabric of temple life. The girls who lived these experiences often found that the stories told in public bore little resemblance to their daily realities. Historians note that myths served a dual purpose. They inspired devotion, while simultaneously masking the human cost of temple practices. Tales of Athena's wisdom and protection glorified the institution, distracting the wider society from the psychological and physical toll exacted on its youngest members. By framing obedience as sacred and endurance as a form of virtue, the myths lent legitimacy to practices that, in modern terms, would be recognized as oppressive. The line between divine command and human authority became blurred, making it difficult to distinguish piety from subjugation. Archaeological evidence supports this. Reinterpretation. Inscriptions, carvings, and remnants of private chambers reveal signs of surveillance, hierarchy, and ritualized control. Some texts hint at disciplinary measures, the structuring of social interactions, and strict codes that regulated even intimate aspects of daily life. These findings suggest that, behind the grand columns and statues of Athena, a calculated system of oversight ensured that the girls' devotion served both spiritual and institutional interests. The public, myths, by contrast, presented a story of virtue and divine favor, creating a stark dissonance between perception and lived experience. The juxtaposition of myth and reality forces a reconsideration of the historical narrative. The young women's sacrifices, the subtle coercion they endured, and the long-lasting consequences of temple life were largely erased from the stories celebrated by society. By examining both the archaeological record and the surviving historical accounts, we gain a glimpse into the hidden world behind Athena's revered image, a world in which devotion, fear, and manipulation intertwined to shape lives in ways that were rarely acknowledged. This exploration challenges us to question the sanitized tales of antiquity and to recognize the hidden suffering that was often ignored in the name of divine glory. The closing chapter of the young women's journey in Athena's temples reveals a truth both sobering and profound. Devotion, while celebrated publicly, often demanded a cost invisible to the wider world. After years of strict discipline, ritualized labor, and psychological conditioning, many of these women emerged with knowledge, resilience, and an understanding of power that few outside could fathom. Yet, this emergence was bittersweet. The personal sacrifices, lost childhoods, strained identities, and enduring trauma remained a hidden testament to the complexities of sacred service. In their survival, they embodied both the strength required to endure oppression and the quiet sorrow of experiences rarely acknowledged in history. The temples, with all their grandeur and ritual, had shaped the girls' lives in ways that blurred the lines between spiritual enlightenment and human manipulation. Their devotion was genuine, yet intertwined with fear, coercion, and the rigid structures imposed by those in power. Even the myths surrounding Athena's favor could not fully obscure the shadow of the suffering endured behind the colonnades and in the Eid and secluded chambers. It is in understanding this duality, the intersection of reverence and repression, that the true history of these women comes to light, offering insight not only into ancient religious practices, but also into the enduring human cost of devotion when unchecked authority prevails. In reflecting on these hidden stories, we confront questions that resonate beyond antiquity. What does it mean to serve something greater than oneself? And at what cost? The sacrifices, endurance, and resilience of these young women remind us of the necessity to look beyond appearances, to question the narratives that glorify devotion without acknowledging the personal toll, and to give voice to those whose experiences were silenced for centuries. Their lives, though marked by hardship, also carry lessons of courage and endurance that transcend time, urging us to examine the price of faith, power, and obedience in all societies. As we close this exploration, consider the untold stories that remain buried in history. Comment below with your reflections on the resilience and suffering of these women. Subscribe to uncover more hidden histories and prepare to follow us into the next dark chapter of ancient secrets. The temples of Athena may have preserved their sanctity in stone and myth, but it is our responsibility to preserve the truth of the lives that were shaped, and sometimes broken, within them.